The morning I found out my wife had been living a double life, I was eating Lucky Charms and reading quarterly earnings reports. Such mundane beginnings for the day that would detonate my entire world. It started with a phone call from Dr. Amanda Foster at Carolina Reproductive Medicine. "Mr. Parker, could you and Jessica come in this afternoon? There's something we need to discuss regarding her examination results." I glanced at the kitchen clock, 8:47 a.m. Jessica had already left for her shift at Children's Presbyterian. 4 years of marriage, and I could set my watch by her routines. Coffee at 6:15, shower at 6:30, out the door by 7:45, scrubs pressed, dark hair pulled back in that practical ponytail she'd worn since nursing school. "Of course, Dr. Foster. Is everything all right?" A pause. In my line of work, corporate finance, pauses mean problems. "It's best if we discuss this in person. Can you both be here at 4 p.m.? "I'll make it work." After hanging up, I stared at the phone. Jessica and I had been trying to conceive for 2 years. The fertility journey had been exhausting. Temperature charts, ovulation predictors, timed intimacy that felt more clinical than romantic. Jessica had become obsessed with it all, downloading apps, joining online forums, marking our calendar with symbols that looked like hieroglyphics. When we finally decided on IVF, I thought we'd reached the light at the end of the tunnel. Jessica seemed relieved too, almost eager to start the process. Dr. Foster came highly recommended, and the initial consultations had gone smoothly. Jessica's medical history interview was scheduled for last week while I was in Atlanta closing a merger. I called Jessica at work. "Hey babe, Dr. Foster wants to see us both at 4 today." "Both of us?" Her voice sounded strange, tight. "Did she say why?" "Just something about your exam results. Probably routine follow-up." Silence stretched across the line. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of the pediatric ward, monitors beeping, children's voices, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. "Jess, you there?" "Yeah, sorry. Busy morning. I'll meet you there." She hung up without saying goodbye. At 3:45 p.m., I sat in the parking lot of Carolina Reproductive Medicine, watching Jessica's Honda Accord pull in. She looked pale through the windshield, gripping the steering wheel even after she'd parked. I walked over as she climbed out. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired. Double shift yesterday, remember?" I didn't remember her mentioning a double shift, but Jessica's schedule was always chaotic. We walked into the clinic together, her hand cold in mine. Dr. Foster's office felt different this time. The motivational posters about new beginnings and miracle babies seemed to mock us. Dr. Foster herself, usually warm and optimistic, wore a carefully neutral expression. "Please sit down." She gestured to the chairs across from her desk. "I wanted to discuss some inconsistencies we've found in Jessica's medical history." Jessica's hand tightened in mine. I could feel her pulse racing. Dr. Foster opened a file. "During the physical examination, we found evidence that suggests Jessica has had a previous full-term pregnancy. However, her medical history indicates no prior births or pregnancies." The words hit me like ice water. Jessica's hand went limp. That's impossible," Jessica stammered. "I've never been pregnant before. Never. You must be mistaken." Dr. Foster's expression remained professionally kind, but firm. "The physical evidence is quite clear. The cervical changes, the abdominal scarring patterns, the breast tissue characteristics, these are consistent with someone who has carried a pregnancy to term and delivered." I turned to look at Jessica. Her face had gone white, and she was staring at her hands. "Jessica?" "There must be some mistake," she repeated, but her voice was barely a whisper. Maybe, maybe the equipment is wrong? Or you're reading someone else's chart? Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly. Jessica, I need you to understand how important accurate medical history is for IVF treatment. Previous pregnancies affect medication protocols, dosing, and risk assessments. If there's anything you haven't told us, now is the time. Jessica stood abruptly. I need some air. I can't. She rushed out of the office. Dr. Foster and I sat in awkward silence for a moment. Dr. Foster, is there any chance you could be wrong about this? She shook her head slowly. I've been doing this for 15 years, Mr. Parker. The physical evidence is unmistakable. I found Jessica in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine running. I knocked on the passenger window until she unlocked it. Jessica, what the hell is going on? Tears were streaming down her face. I don't know what she's talking about, Daniel. I swear to you, I've never been pregnant. This is crazy. But something in her voice, something in the way she wouldn't meet my eyes, told me Dr. Foster wasn't the one who was lying. The drive home was silent. Jessica stared out the window while I replayed every conversation we'd had about starting a family, every discussion about her past, every moment when she might have been hiding something this enormous. That evening, Jessica claimed a migraine and went to bed early. I sat in my home office, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. On impulse, I pulled out our insurance folder and began flipping through old explanation of benefit statements. 2023, nothing unusual. 2022, routine checkups, Jessica's annual physical. 2021, my appendectomy, Jessica's dental work. 2020, there it was. A series of claims I'd never noticed. Prenatal care, $1,200. Obstetric delivery, $4,800. Postpartum care, $600. All billed to Jessica Parker. All dated between November 2019 and March 2020. My hands shook as I stared at the papers. November 2019. We'd been engaged for 6 months. March 2020. 1 month before our wedding. I grabbed my laptop and searched through old calendar entries. November 2019. Jessica had gone to Oregon for what she called a family emergency. Her mother was supposedly having health issues. She'd been gone for almost 3 months, coming back just after New Year's. I'd been swamped with the Hendricks acquisition at the time, working 16-hour days. We'd talked maybe twice a week while she was gone. She'd seemed distant, distracted, but I'd attributed it to worry about her mother. Jesus Christ, she'd been pregnant. During our engagement, she'd been pregnant with someone else's baby. I spent the next hour searching through old photos on my phone, looking for anything from that time period. Most were work-related. Team dinners, client meetings, conference presentations. The few photos Jessica had sent from Oregon were generic. Coffee shops, rainy streets, her supposedly helping her mother around the house. But wait, I pulled up Jessica's Instagram from that period. She'd been active on social media throughout our relationship, posting everything from dinner photos to sunset shots. But from November 2019 through February 2020, there was almost nothing. A few carefully cropped photos, all from the neck up. No full-body shots. No beach vacation pictures she'd normally post. She'd been hiding a pregnancy. My phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. Can't sleep, going for a drive. Be back later. Through the window, I watched her Honda reverse out of our driveway. It was 11 p.m. Since when did Jessica go for late-night drives? I walked into our bedroom and opened her dresser, not sure what I was looking for. Buried beneath old sweaters, I found a shoebox I'd never seen before. Inside were hospital bracelets, ultrasound photos, and a positive pregnancy test dated October 15th, 2019. The baby in the ultrasound was clearly well developed. The date stamp read December 20th, 2019. Jessica had been nearly 3 months pregnant when this was taken. At the bottom of the box was a birth certificate. Baby boy. Born March 15th, 2020. Mother, Jessica Lynn Coleman. Father, Thomas Solomon. Thomas Solomon. Not some random guy, not some college boyfriend named Tommy that she'd barely mentioned. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully replaced the items exactly as I'd found them. My wife, the woman I'd trusted with my entire future, had been pregnant with another man's child during our engagement. She'd given birth to that child and somehow managed to hide it from me completely. But who was Thomas Solomon? And where was this child now? I didn't sleep that night. Jessica came home around 2 a.m., sliding into bed quietly. I pretended to be asleep, listening to her breathing, wondering who she really was. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. After Jessica left for the hospital, I drove to the office of Kevin Walsh, a private investigator my company had used for due diligence on acquisitions. Kevin was exactly what you'd expect from a former police detective. 60-something, gray beard, sharp eyes that missed nothing. His office smelled like coffee and old cigarettes. "I need you to look into my wife," I said without preamble. Kevin didn't even blink. "Infidelity? I think she had a baby with someone else during our engagement. I need to know who the father is and what happened to the child." I showed Kevin the photographs I'd taken. He studied them carefully. "Thomas Solomon," he mused. "Oregon birth certificate. This looks like a closed adoption. When was this baby born?" "March 15th, 2020. "And you were married when?" "April 2020. Kevin whistled low. "She was pregnant with another man's child right up until your wedding. That's cold, even by my standards. Can you find out about Thomas Solomon? And the adoption?" "I can find out about a ham sandwich if you pay me enough. Give me a week." I spent that week in a haze, going through the motions of normal life. Jessica seemed relieved that I'd stopped asking questions about the fertility clinic visit. She even suggested we make another appointment with Dr. Foster. "Maybe I should get a second opinion," she said over dinner Tuesday night. "Sometimes medical equipment can malfunction." "That's a good idea," I replied, cutting my steak with more force than necessary. Kevin called me the following Friday. "We need to meet. What I found is bigger than what you hired me for." We met at a sports bar near his office. Kevin slid a manila folder across the table. "Thomas Solomon, 38 years old, real estate developer based in Seattle. Never been married, no other children on record. Company's called Solomon Properties, does high-end commercial development." I opened the folder. Thomas Solomon was handsome in that polished, expensive way. Perfect smile, perfect hair, perfect suit in every photo. The kind of man who drove a BMW and vacationed in Napa Valley. "Here's where it gets interesting," Kevin continued. "Your wife's social media activity shows multiple trips to Seattle over the past 2 years. Her credit card statements show hotel charges that coincide with Thomas's location tags on Instagram." My stomach dropped. "She's still seeing him?" "Gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective." The adoption was finalized through Pacific Family Services in Portland. The baby's name is Michael Coleman Solomon. He's living with Mark and Linda Foster. Nice couple in their 40s. Couldn't have kids naturally. She named the baby after both of them? Standard practice in private adoptions. But here's the kicker. I found the adoption paperwork. Your wife signed affidavits swearing she had no ongoing contact with the biological father. She also certified that she was single and stable. Kevin pulled out more documents. Problem is, her credit card shows hotel charges in Seattle, starting 2 months after the adoption was finalized. She's been lying to everyone. You, the adoption agency, probably Thomas himself. I stared at the paperwork. Jessica's signature was on document after document, swearing under oath to things that were blatantly false. There's more, Kevin said. Thomas doesn't know about you. I've been monitoring his social media, and he posts about Jessica regularly. Not by name, but by description. Amazing woman I've been seeing. Finally found someone special. He thinks she's single. So she's been lying to both of us. That's the size of it. She's been running cons on 2 different men for 4 years. The betrayal hit me in waves. Not just the affair, not just the secret pregnancy, but the elaborate deception that had defined our entire relationship. Every conversation about starting a family, every discussion about our future, every moment of intimacy, it had all been built on lies. What do you want me to do next? Kevin asked. Find out everything. Where they meet, how often, what Thomas's situation is. I want to know every detail about this double life she's been living. Kevin nodded. And the kid? Michael? Find out about the adoptive family too. If Jessica lied to the adoption agency, those people deserve to know the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Kevin's investigation painted a picture of deception so elaborate it was almost impressive. Jessica and Thomas had been college sweethearts who'd reconnected through social media. Their relationship had continued throughout her time with me, with Jessica using work conferences and family emergencies to cover her trips to Seattle. Thomas's social media showed expensive dinners, weekend getaways, intimate moments that I now realized corresponded to times when Jessica had claimed to be visiting sick relatives or attending nursing seminars. The most damning evidence was a series of hotel receipts. Every time Jessica had told me she was attending a work conference, she'd actually been in Seattle with Thomas. The pattern went back years, dozens of trips, hundreds of lies. But the cruelest discovery was a series of text messages Kevin had obtained through legal channels. Messages between Jessica and Thomas about their son. I miss him so much, one read. Do you think we made the right choice? We had to, Thomas had replied. You weren't ready to leave your husband and I couldn't ask you to. They'd been in contact about the child. They'd been discussing their choice to give him up. And through it all, Jessica had been coming home to me, talking about our future children as if she'd never had one at all. The night I decided to confront her, Jessica came home late from what she'd claimed was a department meeting. She found me sitting in the living room with printouts spread across the coffee table. Daniel, what's all this? Sit down, Jessica. She sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes scanning the documents. I watched the color drain from her face as she recognized hotel receipts, adoption papers, photographs of Thomas. I can explain, she said quietly. I'm sure you can. You've been explaining things to me for 4 years. The question is whether any of it will be true this time. For a long moment, she just stared at the evidence of her double life. Then she began to cry. Not the gentle tears of remorse, but the harsh sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. How long have you known? She asked. 2 weeks, but I should have known years ago. The signs were all there, weren't they? The mysterious trips, the secretive phone calls, the way you flinched every time I mentioned having children. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Which part? The affair, the pregnancy, or the elaborate deception that followed? Jessica wiped her eyes and looked at me directly for the first time. I love you, Daniel. I know that sounds impossible given everything, but I do. You love me? I laughed bitterly. You've been living a double life for our entire relationship. You were pregnant with another man's child when you accepted my proposal. You gave birth to his baby a month before our wedding. How exactly is that love? Thomas and I, it's complicated. We have history. History? Jessica, you've been seeing him throughout our marriage. This isn't history, it's ongoing adultery. She flinched at the word. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me. Help me understand how the woman I married could lie about something this fundamental. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier. Thomas and I dated in college. It was serious. We talked about marriage, children, the whole future. But his family had money and mine didn't. His parents made it clear I wasn't good enough for their son. So you broke up. We tried to, but we kept finding our way back to each other. When I met you at that charity run, I thought I could move on. You were everything Thomas wasn't. Stable, dependable, someone who wanted a life with me regardless of my background. And yet you kept seeing him. It started as closure, one last goodbye, but we couldn't let go of each other. I held up the adoption papers. This is your idea of not being able to let go? Having his child and giving it away? Jessica's composure cracked again. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. I thought if I chose you, chose stability, chose the life I was supposed to want, I could forget about Thomas and move forward. But you didn't forget. No. And when Michael was born? She closed her eyes. I couldn't cut Thomas out completely. He's the father of my child. Your child that you gave up for adoption while lying to everyone involved. I did what I thought was best for everyone. Thomas wasn't ready to be a father. I wasn't ready to leave you. And Michael deserved parents who could give him everything. So you decided to have your cake and eat it too. Keep the husband for stability, keep the boyfriend for passion, and get rid of the inconvenient reminder of your infidelity. Jessica winced. It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple. You made a series of selfish choices and covered them up with lies. Do you have any idea what this has done to me? What it's done to that child's adoptive parents? What it's done to Thomas, who thinks you're single? Thomas knows about you now, she said quietly. What? I told him last week, after the fertility clinic appointment. I knew it was all going to come out. And what did he say? Jessica looked away. He was angry. He thinks I've been using him. Haven't you been? It's not that simple, Daniel. What Thomas and I have is real. What you and I have is real too. They're just different. I stared at my wife. This woman I'd thought I knew completely, and realized I'd been living with a stranger. The Jessica I'd married was a carefully constructed fiction, designed to hide the real woman who was capable of this level of deception. There's something else you need to know, I said, pulling out Kevin's final report. The adoption paperwork you signed contained false statements, perjury. You swore under oath that you had no ongoing contact with the biological father and that you were single and stable. Both were lies. Jessica's face went pale. What does that mean? It means you committed felonies in the process of this adoption. It means the adoptive parents have grounds to void the adoption if they choose. It means you could face criminal charges. They wouldn't. They can't. They can, and they might. Kevin's already identified the violations. The adoption agency takes fraud very seriously, especially when it involves the welfare of a child. Jessica stood up abruptly. I need to call Thomas. I need to figure out what to do. No, Jessica. You need to pack your things. We're done. She spun around to face me. Daniel, please. We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Work through what? The fact that you've been lying to me about literally everything for 4 years? The fact that you have a child with another man? The fact that you've been conducting an affair throughout our entire marriage? It wasn't an affair exactly. Thomas and I have history. Jessica, you've been having sex with another man for the duration of our marriage. That's the definition of an affair. You don't understand the complexity of the situation. The complexity? I laughed humorlessly. The only complex thing here is the web of lies you've created. The truth is actually very simple. You wanted 2 different lives, so you lied to everyone to get them. Jessica sat back down, defeated. What happens now? Now you pack your things and leave. Tomorrow I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you really are. Daniel, please. I know I made mistakes, but I love you. That has to count for something. Love? I looked at the woman I'd planned to spend my life with. The woman I'd trusted with every dream and fear. The woman who'd turned out to be a complete fiction. If this is your idea of love, I never want to experience it again. Jessica tried to argue, to explain, to justify her choices. But there was nothing left to say. 4 years of marriage, 6 years of relationship, and it all came down to a pile of documents that proved everything had been a lie. She packed 2 suitcases that night and left to stay with her sister Amy. I watched her Honda disappear down our street and felt nothing but relief. The next morning, I called Patricia Williams, the divorce attorney my company used for executive separations. Patricia had a reputation for being ruthless when the situation called for it. Adultery throughout the marriage, she said, reviewing Kevin's evidence. Secret pregnancy and birth. Ongoing deception about a child. Perjury in adoption proceedings. Mr. Parker, this is about as clear-cut as divorce cases get. What are my options? In North Carolina, adultery is still grounds for divorce and affects property distribution. But there's something else that might interest you. Patricia pulled out a thick legal book. North Carolina is one of the few states that still recognizes heart-bomb torts, specifically alienation of affection and criminal conversation. Which means what? You can sue Thomas Solomon personally for interfering with your marriage and for having sexual relations with your wife. These are separate civil actions apart from the divorce. Can I win? Patricia smiled grimly. With this evidence? Mr. Parker, alienation of affection awards in North Carolina have reached 6 figures. Thomas Solomon knowingly carried on an affair with a married woman. He's financially liable for the damage to your marriage. Over the next month, we built a comprehensive legal strategy. The divorce petition cited adultery and included every piece of evidence Kevin had gathered. The heart-bomb lawsuits against Thomas sought damages for the willful interference with my marriage. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal remedies. Jessica and Thomas had destroyed my life with their selfishness and deception. I wanted them to understand what that felt like. Kevin's research had revealed that Thomas's business, Solomon Properties, depended heavily on its reputation in Seattle's conservative business community. His major clients were family-owned companies and religious organizations that valued traditional morals. I created an anonymous blog called Seattle Real Estate Truth and began posting the evidence of Thomas's affair with a married woman. The birth certificate showing his abandoned son. The hotel receipts proving his ongoing relationship with someone he knew was married. Within 2 weeks, Thomas's business began to feel the pressure. Two major clients terminated their contracts. His loan applications for new projects were suddenly more scrutinized. His picture-perfect professional image was cracking. But the real pressure came from an unexpected source: Thomas's own family. Kevin's research revealed that Robert and Margaret Solomon, Thomas's parents, were wealthy Catholics who'd built their fortune through careful business practices and strong moral principles. They'd been expecting Thomas to settle down and provide them with grandchildren. I sent them a package containing copies of Michael's birth certificate, the adoption papers, and evidence of Thomas's ongoing affair. The accompanying letter was simple. Mr. and Mrs. Solomon, you have a grandson named Michael Coleman Solomon, born March 15, 2020. Your son abandoned him to adoption while continuing an affair with a married woman. I thought you should know. Kevin reported the aftermath through his contacts in Seattle. The Solomon family was devastated. Robert Solomon called Thomas into his office and threatened to cut him off financially unless he took responsibility for his actions. Margaret Solomon contacted Pacific Family Services directly, demanding information about her grandson. The adoption agency was forced to admit that the biological father had been deceived about the circumstances of the adoption. Thomas's carefully constructed life began falling apart. His parents' financial support disappeared. His business reputation was in tatters. And now his own family was pressuring him to make amends for abandoning his son. But I wasn't finished. The perjury charges against Jessica were moving forward. The Oregon District Attorney's Office took adoption fraud seriously, especially when it involved false statements under oath. Jessica was facing potential felony charges that could result in prison time and the permanent loss of her nursing license. Her sister Amy called me repeatedly, begging me to drop the charges. She made mistakes, Daniel, but she doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed. She destroyed her own life, I replied. And mine. And that child's. And the adoptive family's. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth. Jessica tried to contact me directly, but I'd blocked her number. The few messages that got through via email were pathetic attempts at manipulation, claims that she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, that we could work things out if I'd just give her a chance. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected quarter. Mark and Linda Foster, Michael's adoptive parents, contacted my attorney directly. They'd been devastated to learn about the deception in the adoption proceedings, but they weren't seeking to void the adoption. Instead, they wanted justice for the lies they'd been told. We love Michael like our own son, Linda Foster told me during a video call Kevin arranged. But we had a right to know the truth about his biological parents. The adoption agency assured us that both biological parents had voluntarily relinquished their rights and had no ongoing contact with each other. What can I do to help? I asked. Testify to Jessica's character. Help us prove that she deliberately deceived everyone involved in the adoption process. It turned out that the Fosters had grounds for a civil lawsuit against both Jessica and Thomas for fraudulent misrepresentation. The adoption agency was also facing potential liability for failing to verify the information they'd been given. The legal proceedings moved quickly. The heart bomb lawsuits against Thomas proceeded to trial in the spring. With Kevin's evidence, Patricia presented a clear case of willful interference with marriage. Thomas's attorney tried to argue that Jessica had misrepresented her marital status, making Thomas an unwitting participant in adultery. But the evidence showed that Thomas had known Jessica was married. Hotel receipts included charges for Mr. and Mrs. Parker when Jessica used her married name for airline reservations. The jury awarded me $350,000 in damages, $200,000 for alienation of affection, and $150,000 for criminal conversation. Thomas was also ordered to pay my attorney's fees. The financial judgment devastated what remained of Thomas's business. He was forced to liquidate assets to pay the award, and his reputation in Seattle's business community was permanently damaged. Jessica's criminal trial was even more straightforward. The evidence of perjury in the adoption proceedings was overwhelming. She'd signed multiple documents under oath that contained deliberate falsehoods. Her defense attorney tried to argue emotional distress and complicated circumstances, but the prosecution focused on the impact to the adoptive family and the child. Jessica pled guilty to avoid jail time, but received 5 years of probation and a felony conviction that effectively ended her nursing career. The divorce was finalized 8 months after I'd first learned the truth. Despite Jessica's attempts to claim emotional distress and seek alimony, the adultery finding meant she received only what North Carolina law required, roughly half of our marital assets, minus the costs she'd imposed through her deception. I kept the house, most of our savings, and my retirement accounts. Jessica got her car, some personal belongings, and the knowledge that she'd destroyed 3 families through her selfishness. But the most meaningful outcome was the relationship that developed with Michael's adoptive parents. Mark and Linda Foster turned out to be exactly the kind of people every child deserves. Patient, loving, committed to giving Michael every opportunity. They'd been married for 12 years before adopting, and they treated Michael like the miracle they'd waited for. When they invited me to Michael's 3rd birthday party, I almost declined. What role could I possibly play in this child's life? But Linda Foster insisted. "You helped us learn the truth about his background," she said. "That makes you part of his story." Michael was a beautiful little boy with Thomas's dark hair and Jessica's eyes. He was bright, curious, and completely unaware of the complicated circumstances that had brought him to the Foster family. Watching him blow out his birthday candles, surrounded by people who truly loved him, I realized something I hadn't expected. I felt genuinely happy for him. This child, born from deception and given up through lies, had found his way to exactly where he belonged. Mark Foster approached me during the party. "I want you to know that Linda and I don't regret the adoption. Michael is our son in every way that matters. But we're grateful to know the truth about how he came to us." "What will you tell him when he's older?" "The truth, in age-appropriate ways. That his biological parents weren't ready to be parents, that they made some mistakes, but that he was wanted and loved from the moment he was placed with us." It was a far more generous interpretation than I would have given, but I understood their perspective. Michael's well-being was what mattered now, not the failures of the adults who'd brought him into the world. A year after the divorce was final, I was living a completely different life. The house Jessica and I had shared was sold. Too many memories of a relationship that had never been real. I bought a smaller place closer to downtown Charlotte, somewhere that was entirely mine. Work had been a refuge during the worst of the legal proceedings, and my performance had actually improved. There's something clarifying about discovering that everything you thought you knew about your personal life was a lie. It makes focusing on spreadsheets and market analyses almost therapeutic. I'd been dating Dr. Rachel Martinez for 6 months. We'd met through the hospital where Jessica used to work. Rachel was a pediatrician who'd heard the whole story through the medical community's gossip network. "I know this sounds terrible," she'd said over our first coffee date, "but everyone was talking about what happened with Jessica. Most of us weren't that surprised." "What do you mean?" "Jessica always seemed to be performing her life rather than living it. Perfect wife, perfect nurse, perfect everything. But it felt hollow, like she was playing a role." Rachel was everything Jessica had pretended to be: genuine, caring, someone whose outside matched her inside. She was divorced herself, with 2 children from her previous marriage, and she understood the particular pain of discovering that someone you loved had been lying to you. "The hardest part," she told me one evening, "isn't the betrayal itself. It's realizing that all your memories are contaminated. Every happy moment, every shared experience. You can't help but wonder what else was happening that you didn't know about." She was right. Even now, 2 years later, I couldn't think about my wedding day without wondering if Jessica had been thinking about Thomas. I couldn't remember our honeymoon without questioning whether she'd been comparing me to him. But Rachel was helping me build new memories that weren't tainted by deception. We took weekend trips to the mountains, had quiet dinners without hidden agendas, and planned a future based on honest communication about what we both wanted. The legal consequences for Jessica and Thomas continued to unfold. Thomas's parents had indeed cut him off financially, and his business never recovered from the reputation damage. Last I heard, he'd moved to Portland and was working for someone else's development company. Jessica was working as a medical assistant at a walk-in clinic, one of the few healthcare jobs available to someone with a felony conviction. Her nursing license had been permanently revoked. Amy called me occasionally with updates I didn't ask for. Jessica was living in a small apartment, struggling financially, and dealing with the social consequences of her choices. The nursing community in Charlotte was tight-knit, and word of her deception had spread throughout the network. "She asks about you sometimes," Amy said during one call. "What does she ask?" "Whether you're happy, whether you've moved on. Tell her I'm building a life based on honesty, something she might want to try." The strangest part of the whole experience was running into people who'd known us as a couple. Old friends, work colleagues, people from church. They all struggled with how to react when they saw me alone. Some were sympathetic but awkward, offering condolences as if Jessica had died rather than been revealed as a fraud. Others were clearly uncomfortable, as if infidelity might be contagious, but a few were surprisingly honest about their own observations. "I always wondered about those work trips," said Janet from my old church small group. "Jessica seemed to travel more than any nurse I knew." "She was always vague about her family too," added Mike, a neighbor from our old street. "Remember when you asked me to check on the house while you were both supposedly visiting her mother? Jessica's car was in the driveway the whole time." The signs had been there. I'd just chosen not to see them, or I'd accepted explanations that made no sense because I trusted the person giving them. Kevin Walsh had called it the trust trap during one of our final meetings. "Good people assume other people are good," he'd said. "It's not a character flaw to believe your wife when she tells you something, but it does make you vulnerable to people who are willing to exploit that trust." How do you move forward without becoming paranoid? You learn to verify important things without making it obvious. You pay attention to inconsistencies, and you remember that trustworthy people welcome verification because they have nothing to hide. Rachel and I had talked about this extensively. She'd been through her own version of betrayal, when her ex-husband had hidden a gambling addiction that had nearly bankrupted their family. The key, she said, is learning to trust your instincts again. When something feels off, there's usually a reason. The trick is addressing it directly instead of making excuses for the other person. It was good advice, but it represented a fundamental change in how I approached relationships. With Jessica, I'd been the trusting husband who assumed the best about his wife's motives. With Rachel, I was more cautious, more observant, more willing to ask direct questions when something didn't add up. Rachel seemed to understand this shift. She volunteered information about her whereabouts, introduced me to her friends and colleagues, and made her life transparent in ways that Jessica never had. "I want you to feel secure," she told me. "After what you went through, you have every right to need more reassurance than someone else might." It was a generosity that Jessica had never shown, the willingness to accommodate the consequences of someone else's bad behavior. The third anniversary of Michael's birthday party arrived in March. The Fosters had made it an annual tradition to invite me, and I'd grown to treasure these occasions. Michael was now a confident 5-year-old who called me Uncle Daniel and always saved me a piece of his birthday cake. Watching him grow up had been unexpectedly healing. This child, the living evidence of Jessica's betrayal, had become a symbol of resilience instead. He was thriving despite the circumstances of his birth, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love him regardless of how he'd come to them. "We've been thinking about having another birthday party this year," Linda Foster mentioned as we watched Michael play with his friends. "A different kind." "What do you mean?" "A celebration for us, the adoptive parents. 3 years of being Michael's family. We thought you might want to join us." It was their way of acknowledging that we'd all been affected by Jessica's deception, but we'd all chosen to build something positive from it. The Fosters had their son. I had the truth about who I'd been married to. And Michael had a family that was honest about their love for him. That evening, as I drove home from the party, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about Jessica with anger. The rage that had consumed me during the divorce proceedings had gradually faded into something more like pity. She'd destroyed multiple lives to maintain an illusion that was never sustainable. The elaborate deception that had seemed so sophisticated was actually the desperate scrambling of someone too immature to make difficult choices. Thomas had been equally pathetic in his own way. A man in his 30s who'd convinced himself that an affair with a married woman was somehow romantic rather than simply destructive. But the real revelation was recognizing how much better my life had become without the constant underlying stress of being lied to. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending on the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile Jessica's words with her actions. Rachel and I were planning to move in together that summer. It was a decision we'd approached carefully, with honest conversations about expectations, finances, and long-term goals. "I want to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons," she'd said. "Not because it's convenient or expected, but because we're building something together." It was exactly the kind of conversation Jessica and I had never had. Our relationship had proceeded according to social scripts: dating, engagement, marriage, trying for children, without ever examining whether we actually wanted the same things or were just following a checklist. With Rachel, every step was deliberate. We'd discussed her children's adjustment to a new relationship, my concerns about blending families, and the practical questions of whose house to live in and how to merge our belongings. "This feels different," I told her one evening as we planned the logistics of combining our lives. "Different how?" "Real. Like we're actually building something together instead of just playing the roles we think we're supposed to play. Rachel smiled. That's what happens when two people are honest with each other from the beginning. Honesty. Such a simple concept, but I'd learned how rare it actually was. Not just the big honesty of fidelity and commitment, but the small daily honesty of saying what you mean and meaning what you say. Jessica had been incapable of that level of authenticity. Every conversation had been filtered through the need to maintain her double life. Every shared moment had been contaminated by the secret she was keeping. But the price of her deception had ultimately been paid by everyone involved. Thomas's business and family relationships were permanently damaged. Jessica's career and reputation were destroyed. The adoptive family had been forced to grapple with the realization that they'd been lied to about fundamental aspects of their son's background. And I'd learned that the person I'd planned to spend my life with was essentially a stranger. The legal proceedings were finally complete. The civil judgments had been paid, the criminal sentences served, and the divorce settlements finalized. But the personal consequences would last much longer. Jessica would carry a felony conviction for the rest of her life. Thomas would never fully rebuild his professional reputation. And I would never again enter a relationship with the naive trust I'd brought to my marriage. But there were unexpected benefits too. The experience had taught me to value authenticity over performance, substance over surface, and careful observation over blind faith. Rachel's children, Emma and David, had accepted me into their family with the resilience that children often show. They'd been hurt by their father's gambling addiction, but hadn't let that experience make them suspicious of all adults. Kids are better at moving forward than adults are, Rachel observed. They don't spend as much time analyzing what went wrong or trying to prevent every possible future problem. She was right. Emma and David judged me based on how I treated them and their mother, not on the failures of other adults in their lives. It was a gift I was still learning to give myself, the ability to judge new situations based on present evidence rather than past betrayals. The final piece of closure came from an unexpected source. Kevin Walsh called me on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Thought you'd want to know. Jessica Coleman is getting remarried. To whom? Some guy named Martin Rodriguez. Manages a restaurant in Raleigh. They've been dating for about 6 months. I felt nothing but curiosity. Does he know about her history? That's the interesting part. Apparently, she's been completely honest with him about everything. The affair, the secret pregnancy, the criminal conviction. She told him all of it before they got serious. Huh. People can change, I guess. Or maybe she finally learned that lying is more trouble than it's worth. After hanging up, I found myself hoping that was true. Not for Jessica's sake, but for her new partners. Martin Rodriguez deserved to know exactly who he was choosing to build a life with. It was also a reminder that the capacity for deception doesn't necessarily mean someone is incapable of change. Jessica had paid an enormous price for her choices: career, reputation, family, financial security. Perhaps that experience had finally taught her the value of honesty. Or perhaps she'd simply learned to be more careful about her lies. Only time would tell. But it wasn't my concern anymore. Jessica Coleman Parker Rodriguez was someone else's responsibility now, someone else's risk to take or trust to give. My own life was moving forward on a foundation of transparency that would have been impossible during my marriage. Rachel and I were planning a wedding for the following spring, a small ceremony focused on the people who'd supported us through difficult times. The guest list would include the Fosters and Michael, who was excited about being a ring bearer. It would include my parents, who'd been devastated by Jessica's betrayal but had welcomed Rachel warmly. And it would include Rachel's children, who'd asked if they could call me Dad after the wedding. "Are you sure you want to get married again?" Rachel had asked when we first discussed it. "After everything you went through?" "I want to marry you," I'd replied. "That's different than wanting to get married in general." She'd understood the distinction. Marriage as an institution hadn't failed me. Jessica's character had failed. The legal and social framework of marriage was just a tool. Its success depended entirely on the integrity of the people involved. With Rachel, I was building something based on daily choices to be honest, supportive, and committed. With Jessica, I'd been participating in an elaborate performance piece that had looked like marriage from the outside, but had lacked any genuine foundation. The difference wasn't just in the people involved, it was in the approach to the relationship itself. Rachel and I talked through problems instead of hiding them. We verified important information instead of assuming it was true. And we made decisions together instead of letting one person manage all the important details. It was a partnership in ways that my marriage to Jessica had never been, despite all the surface appearances of domestic bliss. On the 5th anniversary of discovering Jessica's pregnancy test hidden in our bedroom, I was packing my office for the move to Rachel's house. In the bottom of a file drawer, I found the manila folder Kevin Walsh had given me that first day. Copies of all the evidence that had unraveled my entire life. Birth certificate, adoption papers, hotel receipts, insurance claims, ultrasound photos of a baby I'd never known existed until he was already 3 years old. For a moment, I considered throwing it all away. The truth had served its purpose. Justice had been achieved. Everyone had moved on. But then I thought about Michael, now a confident 6-year-old who would someday want to understand his own story. The Fosters had promised to tell him age-appropriate versions of the truth, and someday he might want more details. I sealed the folder and wrote, "Michael's background, full documentation on the outside." Then I put it in my safety deposit box along with my will and other important papers. Someday, if Michael wanted to know the complete truth about his biological parents and the circumstances of his adoption, the evidence would be available. Not the sanitized version his adoptive parents would naturally provide, but the full story of the selfishness and deception that had brought him into the world. But also the story of how multiple families had worked to build something positive from that foundation of lies. How the Fosters had chosen love over disappointment. How I'd chosen truth over vengeance. How even Thomas's parents had eventually found a way to be part of their grandson's life, despite their son's failures. Michael's story wasn't really about Jessica's betrayal or Thomas's cowardice or my discovery of the truth. It was about resilience. The capacity of humans to build meaningful lives even when the starting conditions are far from ideal. That evening, as Rachel and I made dinner together in what was about to become our shared kitchen, I told her about finding the folder and deciding to preserve it for Michael. "Do you think he'll want to know all that when he's older?" she asked. "I think he'll want the choice. And if he does want to know, he deserves the complete truth, not just the comfortable parts." Rachel nodded. "Emma asked me about her father's gambling last week. She's old enough now to understand that adults sometimes make terrible choices." "What did you tell her?" "That people are complicated. That someone can love you genuinely while still making decisions that hurt you. That you can forgive someone without trusting them with your future." It was exactly the kind of nuanced honesty that children deserved but rarely received. The recognition that love and trustworthiness weren't the same thing, that forgiveness and reconciliation weren't synonymous, and that understanding someone's motivations didn't require excusing their behavior. Jessica had probably loved me in whatever way she was capable of loving. But her version of love had included deception, betrayal, and the willingness to build our entire relationship on a foundation of lies. Thomas had probably loved her too in his way, but his version of love had included the abandonment of his own child and the willingness to participate in the destruction of someone else's marriage. Understanding their motivations didn't make their choices forgivable. It just made them human. Flawed, selfish, immature humans who'd prioritize their own desires over everyone else's well-being. But recognizing their humanity also meant acknowledging that redemption was possible, even if it came too late to repair the damage they'd caused. Jessica's new marriage suggested she might have finally learned the value of honesty. Thomas's relationship with his parents had reportedly improved after he'd taken responsibility for abandoning Michael. The Fosters had built a beautiful family despite being deceived about the circumstances of their adoption. Even I had been forced to grow in ways I wouldn't have chosen but was ultimately grateful for. The naive trust I'd brought to my marriage with Jessica would have made me vulnerable to future deception. The careful but not paranoid approach I developed with Rachel was healthier for both of us. Recovery from betrayal, I'd learned, wasn't about returning to your previous state. It was about building something better from the wreckage, incorporating the painful lessons without letting them make you bitter or suspicious. "Ready for the next chapter?" Rachel asked as we finished cleaning up the kitchen. I looked around the house that was about to become our house, at the evidence of two lives carefully merging into something new and honest and sustainable. "More than ready," I said. Outside, Charlotte's summer evening was settling into comfortable warmth. Neighbors were walking their dogs, children were playing in yards, and life was continuing with the steady rhythm of ordinary happiness. It was exactly what Jessica and I had appeared to have from the outside. Suburban domesticity, professional success, the promise of future children. But the appearance had been an illusion, a carefully maintained performance designed to hide fundamental deceptions. With Rachel, the ordinary moments were genuine. When she said she loved me, I knew she wasn't comparing me to someone else. When she made plans for our future, I knew she wasn't keeping other options open. When she came home from work, I knew she was actually coming from work. Simple honesty. It shouldn't have felt revolutionary, but after years of being lied to about everything from weekend conferences to the existence of a child, transparency felt like a miracle. The next morning, as I loaded the last boxes into my truck, I drove past the house Jessica and I had shared. The new owners had repainted it and added a playground in the backyard. A family with young children had moved in, and the house looked happy again. For a moment, I felt a flicker of nostalgia for the life I'd thought I was building there. Then I remembered that the life I'd thought I was building had never actually existed. It had been an elaborate fiction, maintained by lies and sustained by my willingness to believe in something that was never real. The life I was building now was smaller in some ways, more careful, more deliberate. But it was real. Every conversation was genuine, every plan was sincere, and every shared moment was built on the foundation of mutual honesty. It wasn't the life I'd expected to have at 37, but it was better than the lie I'd been living. As I drove toward Rachel's house, our house, I realized I was excited about the future in a way I hadn't been since before Jessica's deception was revealed. Not the desperate excitement of someone trying to rebuild from wreckage, but the confident anticipation of someone who knew exactly what he was building and why. The story that had begun with a phone call from a fertility clinic and the discovery of a hidden pregnancy was ending with a deliberate choice to trust again, carefully and wisely, but completely. It was, I realized, exactly the ending I would have chosen if I'd been brave enough to imagine it.